My name is Malene Brennan. In my family, I've always been the reliable one, the person everyone calls when they need help, the one who steps in no matter the situation. It's been that way for as long as I can remember. Maybe it's because I grew up in a household where family was everything. We didn't have much, just enough to keep the lights on and food on the table. But we always had each other. My parents worked tirelessly, my mom juggling 2 jobs and my dad enduring long hours in construction. And then there was me, the youngest of 4, always trying to keep the peace in a home that was both chaotic and filled with love. From an early age, I learned how to solve problems. Whether it was helping my brothers with their schoolwork or comforting my sister after a breakup, I became the person everyone turned to. I didn't mind. In fact, I found satisfaction in being dependable, in being able to make things better. That mindset followed me into adulthood. I went to college, became a guidance counselor, and spent my days listening to others' struggles and guiding them through their challenges. I loved it. I believed I had found my purpose in helping people. But then everything changed when my sister Chloe lost her husband. Her son Jet was only 12 years old at the time, a boy forced to grow up far too quickly. Chloe was doing the best she could, but the loss shattered her. She needed support, and so did Jet. Without hesitation, I stepped in. He needed stability, and I could provide it. At first, it was just small things. Picking him up from soccer practice, helping with homework, and making sure he had what he needed when Chloe couldn't. Over time, though, my role grew. I became the one attending his games, school events, and parent-teacher conferences. I was the person he confided in, the one he called whenever something was bothering him. I thought I was doing the right thing, but trust is a delicate thing. It takes years to build, but only a single moment, a single choice to shatter. I didn't see the warning signs at first, or maybe I refused to. I didn't want to admit that the lines between love and something else were starting to blur. This is the story of how I broke that trust, how I crossed boundaries I never should have, and how I hurt someone I love deeply. It's not a story I'm proud of, but it's one I need to tell. If sharing it can make even one person pause and think before making the same mistakes, then perhaps it's worth it. Jet adored his mom. Chloe was his world, his anchor. She was the kind of mother who was always present, cheering him on from the sidelines at soccer games, staying up late to help with projects, and comforting him through thunderstorms because she knew how much the sound of rain on the windows scared him. Their bond was rare and unbreakable. But life doesn't care about bonds, does it? Chloe's life ended suddenly one night while driving home after a double shift at the hospital. Exhausted from the long day, she didn't see the drunk driver who ran a red light. In an instant, she was gone. Jet was just 12. I'll never forget the phone call. It was almost midnight, and the loud ring jolted me awake. It was Curtis Clark, a family friend, on the other end. His voice was trembling as he told me, "She didn't make it." My heart sank. All I could think about was Jet. How was I supposed to tell him that the person he loved most in the world wasn't coming back? When I arrived at their house, Jet was on the couch, knees pulled to his chest, staring at the front door as if willing her to walk through it. He didn't cry at first. He just sat there, silent and lost. When I knelt before him and gently told him the truth, it was as though the light in his eyes was extinguished. He didn't say anything, just collapsed into my arms, sobbing so hard that I feared he might break. From that moment, I became everything to Jet. His father had been out of the picture for years, leaving Chloe to raise him alone. Now that she was gone, there was no one else but me. I stepped in because I had to. I couldn't let him down. Initially, it was about covering the basics, ensuring he had food, clothes, and a safe place to sleep. But his grief ran deep, and soon it became more than that. Jet stopped talking to his friends. His grades began to slip, and the vibrant boy he had been faded away. He was angry. At the world, at the driver who had taken his mother, and maybe even at her for leaving him. One night, about 6 months after her death, he finally spoke. We were working on his math homework when he suddenly said, "It's not fair. She was all I had." His voice cracked and tears welled in his eyes. Why did she have to leave? What did I do wrong? Those words broke me. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't his fault, that sometimes life is just cruel. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. Instead, I wrapped my arms around him and whispered, "I'm here, Jet. You're not alone. I'm here." From that day on, I dedicated myself to filling the void Chloe had left. I attended every game, helped with every project, and made sure he knew he was loved. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't be Chloe. And maybe that's where the cracks began to form. Jet leaned on me for everything. He called me constantly, for advice, for reassurance. He even began skipping social outings to spend more time with me. "You're the only person I can talk to, Aunt Malene," he once told me. "You actually listen." Hearing that filled me with a sense of purpose. I believed I was giving him what he needed, but not everyone saw it that way. Curtis, one of the few relatives who still kept in touch, voiced his concerns. "You're doing an amazing job," he said one day over coffee, his tone cautious. "But Jet needs to learn how to stand on his own. He's depending on you for everything, and that's not healthy for either of you." At the time, I dismissed his words. I told myself that Curtis didn't understand. He hadn't seen how much Jet had been through. But looking back, I realized he was right. I wasn't just helping Jet. I was holding on to him too tightly, afraid to let go. And in doing so, I crossed boundaries that should have remained intact. Jet began to change as he grew older. By the time he turned 15, his voice had deepened, his frame had broadened, and the shy boy I had protected was becoming someone new. It should have filled me with pride, and in some ways it did. But it also frightened me. He was pulling away from the world we had built together, and I didn't know where that left me. At first, the changes were subtle. He spent more time in his room with the door shut. He laughed at my jokes less and brushed off my offers to help with homework. He began spending hours scrolling through his phone instead of talking to me. I told myself it was normal. Teenagers go through phases, but it didn't ease the ache in my chest. Then he met Scarlett Larson. She was bright, charming, and effortlessly charismatic. Jet couldn't stop talking about her. For the first time in years, he seemed genuinely happy. And while I should have been happy for him, all I felt was a painful knot in my stomach. "I feel like I'm losing him," I confided to Curtis one afternoon. "Malene, that's a good thing," he replied gently. "Jet's growing up. He's supposed to need you less." I couldn't agree. I didn't know who I was without him needing me. And that fear led me to make choices I'll regret forever. I moaned loudly and clung to him, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced. And yes, it was wrong. I knew that, even then. I should have stopped us, but I couldn't resist him in that instant. From that point on, everything shifted. We convinced ourselves that it wasn't really wrong, that no harm would come of it as long as no one found out. Yet deep down, both of us knew the truth. We normalized something that should never have been, and for a while it felt good, until I overheard a conversation that shook me to my core. It happened not long after Jet started hanging out with his best friend, Bryson Blackwell. They'd met at school a few months after everything between Jet and me had started. Bryson was different, wise beyond his years, always ready with advice that seemed far too mature for someone his age. Jet confided in him more than he did in me, and I could sense the weight of it starting to wear on him. One evening, I heard their voices from Jet's room. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the thin walls of the house made it impossible not to catch pieces of their conversation. "I don't know what to do," Jet admitted, frustration thick in his tone. "It's like I can't stop, but I don't even know if I want it anymore." "What are you talking about?" Bryson asked curiously. Jet hesitated before replying. "It's too much. I feel like I don't even know who I am anymore. She's always there. Always everything. I can't breathe." There was a long silence before Bryson responded, his voice calm but serious. "You have to tell her. You need space. This isn't healthy, Jet. You know that, right?" "I can't," Jet said, his voice cracking. "I don't want to hurt her. She's all I've got." Bryson let out a heavy sigh. "You have to, for both of your sakes." Hearing those words hit me like a blow to the stomach. In that moment, I realized the depth of the damage I had caused. I wasn't just hurting myself. I was hurting Jet, too. Yet I still didn't know how to let go of the only thing that made me feel whole. Things between Jet and me had already grown strained. He was pulling away, spending more time locked in his room or hanging out with Bryson and Scarlett Larson, the girl he had recently started seeing. The small moments we used to share, cooking together, laughing at movies, had become rare. I tried to convince myself that it was just a phase and that he would come back to me, but deep down, I felt the distance growing. It terrified me. One night, I scrolled through old photos on my phone. I found a picture from Jet's 13th birthday, his face covered in cake as he grinned at the camera. I thought about how much had changed since then, how much I had given to him, and how desperately I needed him to stay close. I didn't realize at the time how selfish that need had become. Jet's growing attachment to Scarlett drove me crazy. He'd come home from school, say only a few words, and head right back out to meet her. One evening, he mentioned a party she had invited him to over the weekend. His excitement was clear, but all I felt was panic. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Parties at your age, things can get out of hand." He shot me a look I had never seen before, a mix of annoyance and disappointment. "It's just a party, Aunt Malene. Scarlett's parents are going to be there. It's not a big deal." "But what if—" I began. He cut me off. "What if what?" "Can I have my own life?" "You don't have to worry about me. I'm not a kid anymore." I froze. He had never spoken to me that way, and it stung more than I cared to admit. "I'm just trying to look out for you," I said quietly. "I know," he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "But it feels like— I don't know. I have to go. See you in the morning." The conversation haunted me that night. His words echoed in my mind. Can't I have a life of my own? He was right. I had been holding on too tightly, afraid that if I let him go, I would lose him completely. A few days later, the tension finally reached a breaking point. Jet came home after spending time with Bryson, and I could tell something was wrong. He barely looked at me as he walked past, heading straight for his room. I followed, knocking softly before stepping inside. "Hey," I said gently. "You okay?" He sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a mix of pain, anger, and fear. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but low. My stomach sank. "Okay," I replied, sitting across from him. "What's going on?" He took a deep breath. For a moment, I thought he might back out. But then he spoke, and his words hit me harder than I could have imagined. "I don't even know how to say this, but I felt like I couldn't say no to you for a long time. It's like I didn't have a choice, and it's killing me." I stared at him, stunned. "Jet, I don't understand." He looked away, clenching his jaw. "I've been trying to figure it out for months. Why I keep going along with things I don't want to do. And I think it's because I don't want to disappoint you. But I can't do this anymore." His words hung in the air, suffocating me. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that everything between us had been mutual. But deep down, I knew he was right. I had crossed boundaries I never should have, and now I was watching the consequences unfold before me. After Jet left the room, I sat there for what felt like hours, replaying the conversation in my mind. How had I let it get to this point? How had I convinced myself that what I was doing was okay? The weight of it all was crushing. The next day, I called Rebecca Pina, my best friend from college. She had always been brutally honest with me. When I told her everything, she didn't hold back. "You need to face this, Malene," she said firmly. "You can't fix this until you own up to all of it." "I know," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "But I don't know how to fix it." "You can't fix it overnight," she said gently. "But the first step is letting Jet go. He needs space to figure out who he is without you. And you need to figure out who you are without him." Her words were harsh, but true. I had been holding Jet back, shaping him into someone he didn't want to be. I hated myself for it. A few days later, Jet told me he needed time to process everything. It hurt deeply, but I knew it was necessary. I spent days replaying his words until they were etched into my mind. I wanted to make things right, but I didn't know where to begin. Finally, I wrote him a letter, apologizing and promising to respect his boundaries. Days passed without a response, and I feared I had lost him. But one evening, there was a knock on the door. Jet stood there, letter in hand. "Can we talk?" he asked softly. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. A fragile, uncertain beginning. And that was all I could hope for.